Some friendships are so deep they survive even death itself. Imagine looking into the eyes of someone you loved like a brother, someone you grieved for 20 years, only to find them kneeling before your executioner's blade. Thorrik the Giant was the most feared man in Frostgard, sworn to carry out the jarl's justice without question. But when he saw that familiar scar beneath the condemned thief's eye, his world shattered. This was Leif, his childhood friend, his blood brother who vanished in flames decades ago. The hall waited for the blade to fall. The jarl demanded death, but Thoric faced an impossible choice between duty and loyalty. He could execute his friend and live with the guilt forever, or risk everything to invoke an ancient trial that hadn't been used in generations. What would you do if saving your best friend meant losing everything you'd built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjords like the memory of old sorrows, and in the village of Frostgard, where the mountains met the sea, time seemed to move with the weight of ancient stones. 20 years had passed since the great raid that changed everything. Yet the scars remained, not just on the weathered faces of survivors, but carved deep into the very soul of this harsh northern settlement. At the edge of the village, where wildflowers once bloomed in defiance of the bitter winds, stood a solitary stone. Most who passed it now saw only another marker in a land full of markers, but those with longer memories knew its true significance. The Blood Oath Stone, they called it in whispered conversations, though few dared speak of such things openly anymore. Its surface bore the faint stains of a childhood promise made in earnest blood, when two boys believed their bond could survive anything the world might throw at them. Thoric Eriksson had been 7 winters old when he first met Leif Grimson, a scrawny boy with wild blonde hair and eyes the color of winter sky. It was during the harvest festival, when families from distant farmsteads gathered to share the season's bounty and tell stories that would carry them through the long, dark months ahead. Thoric, already large for his age and bearing the awkward burden that would one day earn him the name Giant, sat alone at the edge of the celebration. His father had died in a hunting accident the previous spring, leaving him and his mother to survive on the charity of neighbors who had their own struggles to bear. Leif approached without invitation, carrying a wooden bowl filled with honey cakes his grandmother had baked. "You look like you could use a friend," he said simply, offering half his treasure to a boy he'd never met. There was no pity in the gesture, no condescension, just the pure recognition of one soul reaching out to another. From that moment, they became inseparable. Through the harsh winter months, when snow piled higher than a man's head and the wind howled like hungry wolves, they found solace in shared adventures. Leif possessed a quick wit and nimble fingers that could fashion toys from scraps of wood and bone, while Thoric's growing strength made him the perfect companion for the bigger adventures their young hearts craved. It was Leif who first suggested they should become blood brothers, having heard tales of ancient warriors who sealed their friendships with sacred oaths. "If we're truly brothers," he reasoned with the logic of childhood, "then nothing can ever separate us. Not distance, not time, not even death itself." They chose the old stone at the village's edge because Leif's grandmother had told them it was blessed by the ancient gods, a place where promises carried extra weight. With a hunting knife borrowed from Thoric's uncle, they each made a small cut on their palms, pressing the wounds together over the stone's weathered surface, while speaking words that seemed to carry the power of destiny itself. "By blood and bone, by wind and stone," young Thoric had intoned, feeling far older than his 8 years. "I swear to stand by Leif Grimson until the end of all things." "And I swear the same to Thoric Eriksson," Leif replied, his voice steady despite the pain in his small palm. Through storm and calm, through joy and sorrow, until the last star falls from the sky, they sealed their oath by each placing a drop of mingled blood upon the stone, watching as it soaked into the ancient granite like a promise absorbed by the very bones of the earth. For 10 blessed years, that promise had been kept with the fierce loyalty that only true friendship can inspire. The boys grew into young men side by side, sharing dreams of glory and adventure as they trained with sword and axe under the tutelage of the village's warriors. Thoric's massive frame filled out with muscle and bone, earning him respect and fear in equal measure, while Leif developed into a quick-thinking strategist whose sharp mind could find solutions where others saw only problems. They complemented each other perfectly, the mountain and the swift stream, strength and cunning working in harmony. When the call came for young men to join Jarl Eric's expedition against the coastal raiders who had been harassing their trade routes, both friends volunteered without hesitation. It would be their first true battle, their chance to prove themselves as warriors worthy of saga and song. They made their preparations with the excitement of youth, polishing weapons and boasting of the glory they would win together. But fate, as it often does, had other plans entirely. The attack came at dawn, on what should have been their departure day. Not the organized raid they had prepared for, but a savage assault by desperate men, driven to violence by harsh winters and failed harvests. Fire arrows fell like burning rain upon the wooden buildings of Frostgard, and the clash of steel rang out across the fjord as warriors scrambled to defend their homes. It's the chaos of that terrible morning. Thoric and Leif found themselves separated by the tide of battle. Thoric, fighting beside his uncle near the harbor, cut down 3 raiders with his massive 2-handed sword before a blow to his head sent him tumbling into unconsciousness. When he awoke, the battle was over. The dead were being counted and Leif was nowhere to be found. The search lasted for days. They combed through the burned ruins of houses, checked every body, both friend and foe, questioned every survivor who might have seen what happened to the quick-witted young man with the bright hair and easy smile. All they found was his sword, its blade snapped in half and buried beneath the collapsed beams of the grain storehouse where the fiercest fighting had taken place. Thoric's grief was a terrible thing to witness. He spent days sitting by the blood oath stone, speaking to the empty air, as if his friend might somehow hear and answer. "I failed you, brother," he whispered to the wind. "I swore to stand by you, and I wasn't there when you needed me most." His mother, Sigrid, feared her son might waste away from sorrow, but gradually something harder and colder began to grow in place of his broken heart. If he could not save those he loved, he reasoned, then perhaps he could at least ensure that justice was done for those who fell victim to the cruelties of this harsh world. Jarl Eric, recognizing both Thoric's grief and his potential, took the young man under his protection. "Channel that pain into purpose," the wise leader counseled. "Let it make you strong enough to protect others from suffering such loss." Over the years that followed, Thoric transformed himself into exactly what Frostgard needed, an enforcer of justice who could not be swayed by tears or threats, who carried out the law with the implacable certainty of winter itself. His reputation grew until even hardened warriors would rather face a bear in its den than stand accused before Thorrik the Giant. He married Astrid, a potter's daughter with gentle hands and a patient heart, who understood that her husband carried wounds that might never fully heal. She gave him 2 strong sons and a daughter with her mother's kind eyes, and slowly, carefully helped him build a new life over the foundations of his old grief. Yet even in his happiest moments, she could see the shadow that lingered behind his eyes, the part of him that remained forever 17 years old, standing beside an empty grave, making promises to the dead. Now, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of fire and gold, Frostgard had grown into a prosperous settlement under Jarl Eric's wise leadership. The harbour bustled with trade ships carrying amber and furs to distant markets, while the surrounding farms produced enough grain to see them through the harshest winters. It was a good life, built through hard work and the kind of justice that kept honest men safe and made wrongdoers think twice before acting on their darker impulses. But prosperity brought its own challenges. As word spread of Frostgard's wealth, it attracted those who preferred to take rather than earn. Thieves and raiders tested the settlement's defenses with increasing frequency, and Thoric found himself busier than ever, ensuring that the law's swift hand reached those who would prey upon the innocent. The great hall where today's judgment would be pronounced had been built to reflect both Frostgard's growing power and its commitment to justice. Massive oak beams, hewn from trees that had weathered centuries of storms, supported a roof high enough to accommodate even Thoric's imposing height. Along the walls hung the shields and weapons of warriors who had died defending their home, while iron braziers cast dancing shadows that seemed to bring the carved dragon heads to life. At the far end of the hall, Jarl Eric's chair of judgment dominated the space, not a throne, for he claimed no royal blood, but a seat carved from a single massive piece of driftwood that had washed ashore the year Frostgard was founded. It was said to be blessed by the sea itself, and decisions made from that chair carried the weight of both earthly law and divine will. Today, as the accused thief was dragged forward in iron chains, Thoric took his customary place beside the executioner's block. His massive frame, now approaching 40 winters, had only grown more intimidating with age. Scars from countless battles marked his arms and face, while his iron-grey beard was braided with the ritual beads that marked his rank as the Jarl's chief enforcer. The ceremony of justice in Frostgard followed ancient traditions, designed to ensure that even the lowliest accused received fair consideration before facing their fate. Witnesses would speak, evidence would be presented, and the Jarl would weigh all factors before pronouncing judgment. But in cases where guilt was beyond question, where the thief was caught red-handed with stolen goods, the proceedings were little more than formality before the inevitable sentence was carried out. Such was the case today. The accused had been discovered in the Jarl's own storehouse, his pockets stuffed with silver coins meant to purchase grain for the coming winter. He had offered no defense save desperate pleas for mercy, claiming hunger and desperation had driven him to crime. But the law was clear. Theft from the common stores endangered the entire community's survival, and the penalty was death. As the prisoner was forced to his knees before the block, Thoric hefted the great axe that had served as Frostgard's instrument of final justice for 20 years. Its blade, kept sharp enough to part a hair, gleamed in the firelight like captured starlight. He had wielded it dozens of times in service to the law, each stroke clean and quick, ending suffering rather than prolonging it. But something was different about this moment. Perhaps it was the way the firelight caught the prisoner's hair, or the familiar cadence of his desperate prayers. As Thoric raised the weapon above his head, the condemned man lifted his face one final time, seeking perhaps a last glimpse of the world he was about to leave behind. And in that instant, across 20 years of grief and guilt, two pairs of eyes met and recognized what time and hardship had tried so desperately to erase. Time stopped in that moment of recognition, as if the very gods themselves had reached down to hold the threads of fate suspended between one heartbeat and the next. The axe trembled in Thoric's massive hands, its weight suddenly impossible to bear as his mind struggled to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with what he had believed to be true for 20 long years. The prisoner's face, gaunt from hardship and marked by the rough living of a man who had known too little comfort and too much sorrow, bore the unmistakable features that had haunted Thoric's dreams. The scar beneath his left eye, earned in a childhood fall from an apple tree they had been raiding together, was faded but still visible. The slight crookedness of his nose, broken in their first real fight, defending a smaller boy from village bullies. And there, when the condemned man parted his lips in a gasp of recognition, the chipped front tooth that had been the prize of their most ambitious adventure. When they had tried to steal honey from a wild hive and paid the price in stings and falls, but it was the eyes that sealed the impossible truth. Winter sky blue, exactly as Thoric remembered, now filled with the same mixture of hope and disbelief that surely mirrored his own expression. Eyes that had once looked at him with absolute trust and brotherhood, now gazing up from the execution block with a desperate question that needed no words to be understood. "Do you remember me, brother?" "Leif," Thoric whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer to gods he had stopped believing in 20 years ago. The great hall, which moments before had been filled with the expectant murmur of witnesses waiting to see justice done, fell silent as winter itself. The condemned man, his friend, his blood-sworn brother, somehow alive after all these years, attempted to speak, but only a broken sob emerged. His hands, bound with iron chains that had rubbed his wrists raw, trembled as he tried to reach toward Thoric, a gesture cut short by his bonds, but carrying all the weight of 2 decades of loss and longing. "Thoric," Leif finally managed, his voice hoarse from years of hardship, but unmistakably the same voice that had once shared every secret and dream. "Brother, silence!" The sharp command cracked across the hall like a whip coming from Jarl Eric himself, the ruler of Frostgard, a man whose wisdom had guided their community through prosperity and peril alike, rose from his seat of judgment with the measured authority of one accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Executioner, you will carry out the sentence immediately. We have wasted enough time on this thief's final theatrics." But Thoric did not move, could not move. The axe remained suspended above his head, as if frozen by the weight of impossible revelation. Around the hall, murmurs began to ripple through the assembled crowd, confusion, impatience, and growing unease as they watched their most reliable enforcer hesitate at the crucial moment. "My jarl," Thoric said slowly, his deep voice carrying clearly through the sudden tension. "I must speak." "You must carry out your duty," Eric replied firmly, though something in his weathered features suggested he sensed the profound shift that had occurred in his great hall. "Whatever game this criminal thinks to play, whatever deception—" "This man is Leif Grimson," Thoric interrupted, a breach of protocol so severe that several warriors reached instinctively for their weapons. In 40 years of serving as Jarl Eric's right hand, Thoric had never once questioned a direct order, never allowed personal feeling to interfere with the execution of justice. "He was my sworn brother, thought dead these 20 years past. He was lost in the great raid when the grain house burned." The prisoner Leif lifted his head higher, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his hollow cheeks. "I tried to save the stores, brother. I tried to fight the fire, but the roof came down. I woke up 3 days' march from here, rescued by traders who found me half dead by the road. By the time I healed enough to travel, months had passed. I came back, but everyone said I was dead, that my body had been found and burned with the others. No one recognized me. The injuries had changed me too much. They drove me away as a madman or a fraud." The words hit Thoric like blows from a warhammer. All these years, while he had mourned his friend's death and carried the guilt of failing to save him, Leif had been alive, wandering lost, probably trying again and again to return home, only to be turned away by people who could not see past the damage that fire and hardship had carved into his familiar features. "Even if this tale were true," Jarl Eric said, though his tone had lost some of its earlier certainty, "it changes nothing. The man stands convicted of theft from our common stores. The law is clear, regardless of who he once was. The law," Thoric said carefully, "also provides for the right of brotherhood. Ancient custom grants that a blood-sworn brother may speak for the accused, may even stand trial in his place if he believes justice has not been served." A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. The right of brotherhood was indeed part of their oldest legal traditions, dating back to the legendary lawgiver Cormac the Wise, but it had not been invoked in living memory. Most present had heard of it only in the old stories told around winter fires. Tales of heroes from the dawn times, when honor and loyalty were valued above all. Else, Jarl Eric's eyes narrowed as he studied both. Men the desperate prisoner and the executioner who had never before shown mercy or doubt. You would stake your own life on this man's innocence. You would risk everything you have built, everything you have become, on a childhood oath made by boys who understood nothing of the world's true nature. The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implication. If Thoric invoked the right and Leif was proven guilty beyond doubt, both men would face death. If he invoked it falsely, claiming brotherhood that could not be verified, the punishment was exile and the stripping of all honors. Either way, he would lose everything: his position, his reputation, quite possibly his life, and certainly his family's security and standing in the community. But as Thoric looked down into those winter blue eyes, he saw not just his childhood friend, but the ghost of the boy he himself had once been. The boy who had sworn by blood and stone that nothing would ever separate them, who had promised loyalty until the last star fell from the sky. That boy had never learned to calculate the cost of keeping promises, had never discovered that the world could be cruel enough to make honor seem like foolishness. Perhaps it was time to remember what it felt like to be that boy again. "I invoke the right of brotherhood," Thoric declared, his voice ringing with the certainty of unshakable conviction. "I claim Leif Grimson as my sworn brother, bound by oaths made in childhood, but sealed with blood that still flows in both our veins. I demand the right to stand trial beside him, to share his fate whatever it may be." The great hall erupted in chaos. Some shouted their approval of such dramatic loyalty, others their condemnation of what seemed like madness. Warriors argued among themselves about the precedent being set, while elders tried to recall the exact provisions of laws that had gathered dust for generations. Through it all, Jarl Erik remained silent, his calculating gaze moving from Thoric to Leif and back again. Finally, he raised his hand for silence, and such was his authority that even the most heated debates died away. "The right has been invoked," he said solemnly. "Ancient law must be honored, even when it inconveniences modern justice. But know this, Thoric Eriksson, if you have chosen poorly, if this man proves false, or if your claimed brotherhood cannot be verified, you will both face the consequences together. The trial will commence at dawn 3 days hence. Until then, both accused will be held under guard." As iron shackles closed around Thoric's wrists, chains he had watched being placed on so many others over the years, he felt something he had not experienced in 2 decades. Not fear, though the rational part of his mind catalogued all the ways this gamble could destroy him. Not regret, though he could see the shocked faces of his wife and children in the crowd, could read the betrayal and confusion in their eyes. What he felt, for the first time since he was 17 years old, was hope. The holding cells beneath Frostgard's great hall had been carved from the living rock of the mountain itself, their walls weeping with moisture that never dried, and echoing with the whispered confessions of countless prisoners who had awaited judgment in their cold embrace. Iron bars, black with age and rust, divided the space into cramped chambers barely large enough for a man to lie down. It was here that Thoric found himself for the first time in his adult life, sharing captivity with the friend he had mourned for 20 years. They sat in silence for a long time, after the guards had left them alone, each man struggling to bridge the chasm that 2 decades of separation had carved between them. Thoric, whose massive frame made the cell seem even smaller than it was, kept stealing glances at Leif's weathered face. Searching for traces of the laughing boy, he remembered beneath the hardened mask that poverty and disappointment had sculpted. Leif looked older than his years, his blonde hair now streaked with premature grey, and his once sturdy frame reduced to sharp angles and hollow places where muscle should have been. The expensive clothes he wore, the stolen finery that had marked him as a thief, hung loosely on his diminished form, making him appear almost childlike, despite the lines that mapped his face like a geography of sorrow. "I never stopped looking for you," Thoric said finally, his deep voice barely above a whisper in the stone chamber. "Even after they said your body had been found, even after we held the funeral rites, part of me kept hoping. I would see a flash of blonde hair in a crowd, or hear someone laugh the way you used to laugh, and for just a moment I would think—" "I know," Leif interrupted softly. "I felt the same. Every time I saw a giant of a man, every time I heard someone called by your name, my heart would leap before reality reminded me that I was dead to everyone I had ever loved." Thoric reached through the bars that separated their cells, and after a moment's hesitation, Leif grasped his hand. The touch was electric, proof that this was no dream or fevered imagination, but solid, breathing truth. Leif's palm bore a scar that matched Thoric's own, the pale line where their childhood knife had sealed their brotherhood with blood and pain. "Tell me what happened," Thoric said. "Tell me everything." And so, in the flickering light of a single torch that cast more shadows than illumination, Leif began to speak of 20 years of wandering and loss. His voice, though roughened by hardship, still carried the cadence that Thoric remembered, the particular rhythm of thoughts shared between minds that had once seemed to think as one. He spoke of waking in a trader's wagon, his body broken, and his memories shattered by the blow that had felled him in the burning storehouse. The merchants who had found him were kind but practical people, more concerned with reaching their destination than with nursing a stranger back to full health. They had fed him, tended his wounds, and dropped him at the next settlement with a few coins and their best wishes for his recovery. By the time Leif had healed enough to travel, months had passed and the seasons had turned. When he finally made his way back to Frostgard, he found a community in mourning, his own death accepted as fact and his place in the world already filled by others. The injuries he had sustained, burns that had twisted the left side of his face, a broken collarbone that had healed crooked, and countless smaller marks that changed his familiar features, had transformed him into a stranger even to those who had known him all his life. "I tried to convince them," Leif said, his grip tightening on Thoric's hand. "I told them stories only I could know, reminded them of things we had done together, places we had been. But they looked at me like I was mad or cursed, claiming to be someone they had already buried. Your mother was the kindest. She gave me food and a place to sleep for one night, but even she could not see past what the fire had done to me." The pain in his friend's voice cut Thoric deeper than any blade. To imagine Leif standing before Sigrid, desperately trying to prove his identity while she looked upon him with the pitying eyes reserved for the delusional, was almost unbearable. His mother had loved Leif like a second son, had mourned his loss almost as deeply as Thoric himself. "I should have known," Thoric said, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "I should have seen through whatever changes the fire made. A true friend, a true brother, would have recognized you no matter what, and how could you?" Leif asked gently. "I was dead and buried, remember? The very idea that I might still live was impossible. Besides, I was not the same person you remembered. The fire changed more than just my face, brother. It burned away parts of who I used to be, left me hollow and strange even to myself. After being turned away from Frostgard, Leif had wandered from settlement to settlement, taking whatever work he could find and never staying long enough to form the kind of bonds that might anchor a man to one place. He had labored in mines and fishing boats, served as a guard for merchant caravans, and even spent a winter as a storyteller in a jarl's hall far to the south, spinning tales of heroes and monsters for nobles who never suspected their entertainer was himself a character from such a story. But always, he had been drawn back toward home like iron to a lodestone. 3 times he had returned to Frostgard, hoping that time had changed faces enough for someone to see past his scars to the boy beneath. Each time he had been driven away more firmly than the last, until finally he had been warned that another return would be met with violence. "So why did you come back this time?" Thoric asked. "Why risk everything for a few coins from the storehouse?" Leif was quiet for so long that Thoric began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness beyond their cells. "Because I was dying," he said simply. Not dramatically, not from any great injury or noble cause. Just slowly, quietly, the way a candle burns down when there is no more wick to feed the flame. "I'd been living on scraps and charity for months, too weak to work, too proud to beg openly. When I heard that Frostgard was prospering, that there was grain in abundance and silver to buy more, I thought perhaps I could take just enough to survive another season," He turned to look directly at Thoric, and in his eyes was a pain deeper than any physical wound. I told myself I was only taking back what should have been mine by right, what I would have earned if I had been allowed to return home. But the truth is simpler and more shameful than that. I was stealing from my own people because I no longer had the strength to die honorably. The admission hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread. Thoric felt the full weight of all the years his friend had suffered alone, carrying burdens that should have been shared, facing trials that should have been met with brotherhood and support. The injustice of it burned in his chest like molten metal, fueling a rage that had been building since the moment of recognition. In the darkness of their prison, surrounded by stone walls that had witnessed countless confessions and final words, Thoric made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours before. Whatever happened in the trial to come, whatever price he had to pay for invoking ancient laws in service of an older loyalty, he would not allow his friend to face judgment alone again. "We will find a way through this," he said, with the certainty of a man who had never broken a promise that truly mattered. "Whatever it takes, whatever we have to prove or endure, we will face it together." That is what brothers do. Outside their cell, footsteps echoed in the corridor as guards made their rounds, their presence a reminder that dawn and judgment were drawing closer with each passing hour. But in the small space they shared, two men who had been boys together began to plan for a trial that would determine not just their fate, but the true meaning of honor, loyalty, and justice in a world that had forgotten the value of such things. The morning after Thoric's shocking declaration brought visitors to the holding cells, their footsteps echoing through the stone corridors like harbingers of judgment yet to come. The first to arrive was Astrid, Thoric's wife, her usually gentle face drawn tight with an expression he had never seen before, a mixture of bewilderment, hurt, and something that might have been betrayal. She stood before the iron bars that separated them, her potter's hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles showed white as bone. For a long moment she simply stared at her husband, as if trying to reconcile the man she had married with the one who had thrown away everything they had built for the sake of a stranger's life. 23 years, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor Thoric could detect beneath its surface. 23 years we have been wed, and in all that time you never once mentioned this man's name. You spoke of childhood friends lost in the raid, yes, but never with such detail, never with such emotion that I understood one of them could command your loyalty above all else. Thoric rose from the stone floor where he had been sitting, his massive frame unfolding until he stood pressed against the bars, as close to his wife as their circumstances would allow. "Astrid, Do not," she interrupted, holding up one hand to stop his words. "Do not attempt to explain or justify what cannot be explained or justified. You have risked not only your own life, but the security of our children, the stability of our household, the respect of our community. And for what? A man who may or may not be who he claims to be, who stands convicted of theft regardless of his identity. Behind Thoric, Leif had pressed himself into the shadows of his cell, trying to make himself as small and inconspicuous as possible during this intimate confrontation. But Astrid's sharp gaze found him anyway, studying his weathered features with the careful attention she usually reserved for examining pottery for cracks and flaws. "You do have his eyes," she admitted reluctantly. "And there is something in the shape of your face that reminds me of the descriptions Thoric gave when he was drunk and melancholy on the anniversary of the raid. But eyes and faces can be deceiving, and desperate men often find ways to become what others need them to be." "He bears the scar," Thoric said quietly. "The mark of our blood oath, exactly where it should be, exactly as it should look after all these years. No fraud could know such details. No impostor could bear such proof." Astrid's expression softened slightly, though steel remained in her voice. "Perhaps not. Perhaps this truly is the friend you mourned, returned from what seemed like death itself. But even if that is so, it changes nothing about the choice you have made. You have gambled our children's future on a loyalty that belongs to the past." The weight of her words settled over Thoric like a burial shroud. His children, Bjorn, strong and thoughtful at 16, already showing promise as a warrior and leader. Magnus, clever and quick-witted at 14, with his mother's gentle hands and gift for crafting beautiful things. And little Sigrid, named for Thoric's mother, barely 8 years old and still young enough to believe her father was invincible. What would become of them if he was executed or exiled? What kind of life would they have as the children of a man who had betrayed his duty for the sake of sentiment? "They will be provided for," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Jarl Erik is a just man. Whatever happens to me, he will not allow them to suffer for their father's choices." "Charity?" Astrid spat, the word like poison on her tongue. "My children will live on charity because their father chose to honor a childhood promise over the vows he made as a man grown. They will grow up knowing that when the time came to choose between his first family and his second, he chose the past over the present." The accusation hit harder than any physical blow. Thoric had faced death in battle without flinching, had carried out executions and difficult judgments without losing sleep. But the pain in his wife's eyes was almost unbearable. She was right, of course. In choosing to save Leif, he had also chosen to risk everything else he held dear. "Would you have me be the kind of man who could watch his sworn brother die without lifting a hand to help?" he asked quietly. "Would you have me live with that knowledge for the rest of my days, knowing I had broken the most sacred oath I ever made?" "I would have you be the kind of man who remembers that he has made other oaths since then," she replied. "Sacred vows to love and protect his wife and children, to provide for them and keep them safe from harm. But perhaps those promises matter less because they were made to people who are still alive, who can suffer from your choices rather than simply being disappointed by them from beyond the grave." The bitter truth of her words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Astrid turned to leave, but paused at the threshold of the corridor, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that would haunt Thoric's dreams for whatever time remained to him. "I pray you are right about this man," she said softly. "I pray he truly is the friend you remember, and that your sacrifice proves worthy of the price we will all pay for it. Because if you are wrong, if he is simply a clever thief who has found a way to manipulate your guilt and longing, then you will have destroyed everything good in your life for nothing." After she left, silence settled over the cells like a heavy blanket. Leif finally emerged from the shadows, his face pale and drawn with the weight of what he had witnessed. "She's right to hate me," he said quietly. "I am the ghost that has come to destroy her family's peace. Perhaps it would be better if—" "No," Thoric said firmly. "Do not speak of abandoning hope now, not when we have found each other again after all these years. Astrid is angry and frightened, but she is also wise. In time, she will understand why this choice had to be made. And if she does not, if the trial goes badly and you lose everything you have built here." Thoric was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that went to the heart of everything he had wagered. Finally, he looked at his friend with eyes that held no doubt, no regret, only the steady certainty of a man who had made peace with his decisions. "Then I will face that consequence, knowing I kept the most important promise I ever made," he said. "A man's word is all that truly belongs to him in this world. Everything else, position, wealth, even family, can be taken away by fate or circumstance. But honor, once lost, can never be recovered." Outside their prison, the sun was setting on the second day of their captivity, bringing them one step closer to the trial that would determine their fate. But in the growing darkness, two men who had been separated by time and tragedy began to plan for a battle that would be fought not with swords or axes, but with truth itself as their only weapon. The third morning of their imprisonment dawned grey and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the stone walls of their cells. Today would bring the trial that would determine whether Thoric's gamble would be vindicated or prove to be the catastrophic mistake that destroyed 2 lives instead of saving. And Bjorn Eriksson stood in the corridor outside their cells, his young face bearing an expression of determination that reminded Thoric painfully of himself at the same age. At 16, Thoric's eldest son had already grown tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of steady presence that marked him as a natural leader among his peers. "Father," he said simply, inclining his head in the formal greeting one warrior might give another, rather than the casual affection of a son. "Bjorn," Thoric replied, matching his son's formal tone, though his heart ached to reach through the bars and embrace the boy who had always been his pride and greatest joy. "You should not be here. I am 16 years old," Bjorn interrupted with quiet authority. "Old enough to understand the consequences of honor and duty. If you can risk everything for the sake of loyalty, then I can at least stand here and look upon the choice you have made. You have your father's eyes," Leif said quietly, "and his way of standing as if the ground belongs to you by right. He was the same at your age, proud, stubborn, certain that the world could be bent to his will through conviction." Bjorn studied Leif carefully. "My mother says you might be an imposter, that desperate men often become what others need them to be." "Your mother is wise," Leif acknowledged. "But some truths can be proven beyond mere testimony." With careful deliberation, Leif began to speak of things only he could know. He told of the secret place behind the waterfall where 2 boys had hidden their treasures, carved wooden figures, smooth stones, pieces of a Roman coin found on an old battlefield. He described their ritual of visiting Thoric's father's grave each spring, leaving wildflowers and sharing their adventures. Most convincingly, he recounted the story of the great salmon that nearly drowned young Thoric when he tried to catch it bare-handed. Only Leif's quick thinking had saved his friend from being swept downstream, a rescue that left both boys sworn to secrecy. "He told that story," Bjorn admitted slowly, "many times when he had been drinking and spoke of friends lost in the raid. He said the salmon taught him the difference between courage and recklessness." Bjorn moved closer to the bars. "If you are truly who you claim to be, then you are family, bound by oaths that predate my birth. I make no claims on your loyalty," Leif replied carefully. "Your father has already risked too much for my sake. But you are not a stranger," Bjorn said. "You are the brother my father mourned, the ghost he carried in his heart. I used to wonder why he looked so sad, watching me and Magnus play together. Now I understand. He was remembering what it felt like to have a brother of his own. The admission carried weight that none of them had fully considered. Thoric had not just risked his position for Leif's sake. He had also denied his children the chance to know their father's sworn brother, had deprived them of an uncle who might have enriched their lives. "There is something else," Bjorn said, glancing around before continuing in a whisper. "The jarl has been meeting with advisors about the right of brotherhood. The trial will have 3 parts. Prove your brotherhood beyond doubt, prove Leif's innocence or mitigating circumstances, and—" He paused reluctantly. "Third," Thoric prompted, "trial by combat, not against each other but against champions chosen by the jarl. Only if you survive all 3 trials will you both be declared free." The weight of revelation settled over them like a burial shroud. It was one thing to gamble on proving brotherhood and innocence, through words and evidence, quite another to face armed combat against opponents chosen specifically for their skill and ruthlessness. But even as fear tried to take root, Thoric felt determination stirring, the same fierce resolve that had carried him through countless battles. He had chosen this path knowing it might lead to death. Now he would walk it to whatever end awaited, secure in the knowledge that he had finally kept the promise that mattered most. The morning wore on as other visitors came and went. Magnus, Thoric's younger son, brought bread and water from their mother, his 14-year-old face pale but resolute as he tried to understand why his father had chosen this dangerous path. Little Sigrid was kept away, deemed too young to witness her father's imprisonment, though Thoric could hear her voice echoing from the upper corridors as she asked her brothers when their father would come home. Each visit reinforced the magnitude of what he had risked. his family's security, his position in the community, the respect he had earned through 20 years of faithful service, all of it hung in the balance because he could not bear to watch his childhood friend die without trying to save him. As the sun reached its zenith, marking the approach of the trial hour, Thoric found himself thinking not of the combat to come or the evidence they would present, but of the blood oath stone that still stood at the edge of Frostgard. That weathered granite marker had witnessed their childhood promise, had absorbed their mingled blood and sealed their brotherhood with bonds stronger than law or custom. Today, that promise would finally be tested not by time or distance, but by the ultimate measure of what one man was willing to sacrifice for another. Whether they lived or died, whether they were vindicated or condemned, Thoric knew he had made the only choice he could live with. In the cell beside him, Leif sat quietly, his winter-blue eyes reflecting the same mixture of fear and resolve that Thoric felt in his own heart. They had been boys when they swore their oath, too young to understand the true weight of such promises. But they were men now, and they would face the consequences of that childhood bond with the wisdom that only years of hardship and loss could provide. To the sound of marching feet echoed through the corridors as guards came to escort them to their trial. Iron keys turned in ancient locks, and cell doors swung open with the grinding protest of metal against stone. As they were led up the stone steps toward the great hall where their fate would be decided, Thoric felt the weight of history settling upon his shoulders. This was no ordinary trial, no simple matter of guilt or innocence. This was a test of the oldest laws and deepest values that their people held sacred, the power of brotherhood, the meaning of loyalty, and the question of whether honor was worth more than life itself. Whatever the outcome, they would face it together, as brothers should. The great hall of Frostgard had been transformed for the trial, its familiar warmth replaced by an atmosphere of solemn judgment that seemed to press down upon all who entered. Extra benches had been arranged to accommodate the crowds who had come to witness this unprecedented invocation of ancient law, while additional torches cast dancing shadows that made the carved dragon heads along the walls appear to writhe with anticipation. At the center of it all sat Jarl Eric in his chair of judgment, the massive piece of driftwood seeming to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. His weathered face bore no emotion as Thoric and Leif were led forward in their iron shackles, but his eyes, sharp as winter ice despite his advancing years, missed nothing as they studied the two men who had thrown his carefully ordered world into chaos. To his right stood Olaf the law speaker, eldest of the village council and keeper of their legal traditions. The old man's memory was legendary, containing within it the accumulated wisdom of generations past, including laws and customs that had not been invoked in living memory. In his gnarled hands, he held a staff carved with runic symbols, each mark representing a different aspect of their ancient code of justice. "We are gathered," Olaf began, his voice carrying clearly despite its age-worn rasp, "to witness the trial of Thoric Eriksson, who claims brotherhood with the accused thief, Leif Grimson, and who has invoked the sacred right of brotherhood in defiance of settled judgment. Let all who are present understand that this trial will proceed according to laws older than our settlement, older than the memory of our grandfathers' grandfathers." The crowd stirred restlessly, many of them hearing these formal words for the first time in their lives. Among the witnesses, Thoric could see familiar faces, merchants whose goods he had recovered from thieves, farmers whose disputes he had settled, warriors who had fought beside him in defense of their home. Some looked at him with sympathy, understanding the impossible choice he had made, while others wore expressions of betrayal and confusion. In the front row sat his family. Astrid held little Sigrid close, the child's eyes wide with incomprehension at seeing her father in chains. Ignis and Bjorn flanked their mother, both boys struggling to maintain composure while their world crumbled around them. The sight of their faces, frightened, proud, heartbroken, cut deeper than any blade ever could. The first trial Olaf continued, concerns the validity of the claimed brotherhood. Ancient law requires that such bonds be proven not merely through the words of the claimants, but through the testimony of witnesses and the presentation of evidence that cannot be falsified or feigned. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd as an elderly woman made her way slowly forward, supported by a walking stick carved from whalebone. Thoric's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Ingrid, Leif's grandmother, now ancient beyond measure, but still possessed of the keen intelligence that had made her one of Frostgard's most respected elders. "I would speak," she said, her voice thin but carrying the authority of extreme age. "I would speak of boys I knew and promises I witnessed." Jarl Erik nodded gravely. "The court recognizes Ingrid, Olaf's daughter. Speak your words, grandmother." The old woman's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with memory, moved from Thoric to Leif and back again. For a long moment, she studied the man who claimed to be her grandson, searching his weathered features for traces of the boy she had raised after his parents' death. 40 summers have I lived in this village," she said slowly, "and I have seen children grow to warriors. Warriors fall in battle, and heroes fade into legend. But I have never forgotten the day 2 boys came to me, hands bloody from self-inflicted wounds, asking me to bind their cuts and witness their oath." Her words sent a shock through the hall. Many had suspected that the blood oath was genuine, but to have it confirmed by someone whose word was beyond reproach carried enormous weight. They stood before the old stone at the village edge. Ingrid continued, speaking words they barely understood but meaning them with all their hearts. "By blood and bone, by wind and stone," they said, and they sealed their promise with pain willingly shared. "I told them then that such oaths were not children's games, that the gods would hold them to their word even unto death." She paused, her gaze focusing entirely on Leif. "You bear the marks of fire and hardship, child, but you have your mother's nose and your father's stubborn chin. More than that, you have the eyes of one who has kept faith despite all reason to abandon it. You are Leif Grimson, son of my son, and I would know you if you had been burned beyond all recognition." The formal confirmation from such an unimpeachable source sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Several people who had been skeptical of Leif's identity now looked at him with new understanding, seeing past the ravages of time and hardship to the boy who had once played in their streets. But Jarl Erik raised his hand for silence, his expression unchanged. "The testimony of kinship is noted and accepted. However, the first trial requires more than family recognition. It requires proof of the bond itself, evidence that these 2 men shared the kind of experiences that create unbreakable loyalty." This was the moment Thoric had been dreading. How could they prove something as intangible as friendship? How could they demonstrate the depth of a bond forged in childhood adventures and sealed with blood? The answer came from an unexpected source. Gunnar, the village smith, stepped forward with something wrapped in oiled leather. His massive arms, scarred from years of work at forge and anvil, handled the package with surprising gentleness as he unwrapped it to reveal 2 small objects that gleamed in the torchlight. "I made these," he said simply, holding up what appeared to be matching arm rings, bands of silver worked with intricate knotwork patterns, commissioned by 2 boys who had more enthusiasm than coin, who worked in my forge for an entire summer to earn the price. They said the rings had to be exactly identical, forged from the same silver, cooled in the same quench, so that nothing could ever truly separate them. Thoric felt his heart stop as memory flooded back. The summer of their 15th year, when they had decided their blood oath needed a physical symbol that could not be lost or forgotten. They had labored in Gunnar's smithy, hauling coal and pumping bellows until their hands were black and their backs ached, all to earn the silver rings that would mark their brotherhood. "Where are these rings now?" Jarl Erik asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "I have worn mine every day since it was made," Thoric said, extending his left arm to show the silver band that encircled his wrist above the iron shackle. The metal had been polished smooth by 20 years of wear, but the intricate knotwork was still clearly visible. All eyes turned to Leif, who slowly lifted his own left arm. There, identical to Thoric's ring save for the deeper patina of harder wear, was its match. The crowd gasped at this tangible proof of their bond, evidence that could not be faked or fabricated. "The first trial is satisfied," Olaf declared formally. "The brotherhood has been proven beyond doubt through witness, testimony and physical evidence. Let the record show that Thoric Eriksson and Leif Grimson are bound by sacred oath, confirmed by ancient law." But even as relief flooded through Thoric, he knew their greatest challenges still lay ahead. Proving brotherhood was one thing. Demonstrating Leif's innocence, or at least establishing mitigating circumstances for his theft, would be far more difficult. And beyond that loomed the trial by combat that could claim both their lives even if they succeeded in all other aspects of their defense. Yet, as he looked at his friend, his brother, standing beside him with quiet dignity despite their circumstances, Thoric felt a surge of the same determination that had carried them through childhood adventures and adolescent trials. They had come this far together. Whatever else awaited, they would face it as they always had, side by side, united by bonds stronger than iron chains or the threat of death itself. The second trial began immediately, with no respite allowed for the accused to savor their initial victory. Olaf, the law speaker, struck his runic staff against the stone floor 3 times, the sharp sound cutting through the murmur of voices like the crack of a whip. "The second trial concerns the matter of guilt and innocence," he announced, his ancient voice carrying the weight of centuries of legal tradition. "Leif Grimson stands accused of theft from the common stores, a crime that threatens the survival of the entire community. The evidence against him is clear and undeniable. He was found with stolen silver in his possession, caught in the very act of taking what was not his to take." Jarl Erik leaned forward in his chair of judgment, his weathered features carved into an expression of stern authority. "Before we proceed further, let the accused speak for himself. Leif Grimson, do you deny the charges brought against you?" Leif stepped forward as far as his shackles would allow, his head held high despite the shame that burned in his winter-blue eyes. "I do not deny taking the silver, my Jarl. I was found with your coins in my hand, caught in your storehouse like a common thief in the night. The facts are not in dispute." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled crowd. Most had expected him to plead innocence or offer excuses for his actions. Instead, he had confessed with a directness that bordered on the suicidal. "Yet," Leif continued, his voice growing stronger, "I would ask the court to consider not just what I did, but why I did it. I would ask that the law look not merely at the crime, but at the circumstances that drove a man to such desperate measures." Thoric watched his friend with a mixture of pride and terror. This was exactly the kind of bold honesty that had marked Leif even as a child. The willingness to face consequences head-on rather than hide behind lies or half-truths. But in a legal system that dealt primarily in absolutes, such honesty might prove to be a fatal mistake. "Speak then," Jarl Erik said, though his tone offered little hope of mercy. "Tell us of these circumstances that you believe might excuse theft from the common stores." Leif drew a deep breath, gathering his thoughts like a warrior preparing for a charge into battle. 20 years ago, I was a citizen of Frostgard, born here, raised here, sworn to defend this community with my life if necessary. When raiders came, I fought beside my brothers to protect our home. When the storehouse caught fire, I ran into those flames not to steal, but to save what I could of our winter supplies. His voice caught slightly, and Thoric could see the old pain flickering in his eyes like embers from that long-ago fire. The roofs fell on me as I tried to carry out sacks of grain. When I woke, I was 3 days' march away, rescued by traders who found me more dead than alive by the roadside. They cared for me as best they could, but when I finally healed enough to travel, months had passed. I returned home to find my own grave, my own death, accepted as fact. The great hall had grown utterly silent as Leif spoke, every person present hanging on his words with rapt attention. Even little Sigrid had stopped fidgeting in her mother's arms. Sensing the gravity of the moment, for 20 years, Leif continued, I have wandered as a man without a home, without family, without the bonds that make life worth living. 3 times I returned to Frostgard, hoping that time had changed faces enough for someone to recognize me. 3 times I was driven away as a madman or an impostor, threatened with violence if I dared return. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd, faces that belonged to people who had known him as a child, but had failed to see him as a man. I do not blame you for that failure, he said gently. The fire changed me in ways that went deeper than scars and burns. It took away not just my appearance, but my place in the world, my very identity. I became a ghost, haunting the edges of life, neither fully alive nor properly dead. Astrid, sitting in the front row with her children, shifted uncomfortably. Thoric could see recognition dawning in her eyes, not physical recognition, but understanding of the profound injustice that had been done to this man. So yes, Leif said, his voice rising with quiet passion, I took silver from the storehouse. But I took it not as a stranger stealing from people he did not know, but as a son of Frostgard, claiming what should have been his birthright. I took it because 20 years of honest labor in foreign lands had earned me nothing but an early grave, and I was too tired to die in the gutter like a masterless dog. The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that went far beyond simple guilt or innocence. This was not just a case of theft. It was a tragedy of identity lost and community failed, of a man driven to crime by circumstances that should never have been allowed to exist. But it was what happened next that transformed everything. They thought they knew about the case. An elderly man rose slowly from the back of the hall, his movement stiff with age and what appeared to be considerable reluctance. Thoric recognized him as Sven the Merchant, one of the wealthiest traders in Frostgard, and a man whose word carried considerable weight in matters of commerce and law. My jarl, Sven said, his voice barely above a whisper, I must speak. I must tell what I know, though it shames me to have kept silent so long. Jarl Erik frowned, sensing that whatever was about to be revealed would complicate matters considerably. Speak, Sven Eriksson. What knowledge do you bear that pertains to this trial? Sven's weathered face had gone pale, and his hands trembled as he stepped forward. 20 years ago, when the raid came and the storehouse burned, I was there. I was in the building when it caught fire, trying to save what I could of the goods I had stored there on consignment. A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. No one had known that anyone besides Leif had been in the burning building. I saw him, Sven continued, his voice growing stronger with the weight of truth finally being spoken. I saw Leif Grimson risk his life again and again, carrying out sacks of grain and barrels of preserved meat, while the flames grew higher and the smoke grew thicker. He saved more of our winter stores than any 3 other men combined. The revelation struck the assembly like a physical blow. If this was true, then Leif was not just innocent of the current charges. He was a hero whose sacrifice had been forgotten and whose very existence had been denied. But there is more, Sven said, his voice now barely audible with shame. When the roof began to fall, I ran for safety. I left him there, trapped beneath burning timbers, and I said nothing when his body could not be found. I let everyone believe he had died because, he paused, swallowing hard, because I had taken some of the silver myself in the confusion. I thought if questions were asked, if his survival meant an investigation, my own theft would be discovered. The words hit the great hall like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Sven the Merchant, respected citizen and successful trader, was confessing to the very crime for which Leif now stood accused, and revealing that he had allowed an innocent man to be declared dead rather than risk exposure of his own guilt. For 20 years, Sven continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, I have lived with the knowledge that Leif Grimson was a hero who saved our community's survival, while I was the actual thief who stole from our common stores. I have prospered while he wandered as a homeless beggar, and I have said nothing because I was too cowardly to face the consequences of my actions." The great hall erupted in chaos. Shouts of anger and disbelief filled the air as people tried to process this stunning reversal. Some called for Sven's immediate arrest, while others demanded to know how such an injustice could have been allowed to persist for 2 decades. But through it all, Thoric found himself looking not at the confessing merchant or the outraged crowd, but at his friend, his brother, who stood with tears streaming down his fire-scarred face. Not tears of joy at his vindication, but tears of profound relief that the truth had finally been spoken after 20 years of silence. Jarl Erik struck his staff against his chair repeatedly, demanding order in his hall. When quiet finally returned, his voice carried a weight of judgment that made even the boldest warriors shrink back. "The second trial is concluded," he declared. "Leif Grimson stands not merely innocent of the charges against him, but revealed as a hero whose sacrifice has been forgotten and whose honor has been stolen along with his identity. The real thief has confessed his crime and will face justice accordingly." But even as relief flooded through Thoric at this unexpected vindication, Olaf the law speaker struck his runic staff against the floor, reminding all present that one trial remained. "The ancient law has been satisfied regarding brotherhood and innocence," the old man announced. "But the right of brotherhood demands one final test, trial by combat, to prove that the gods themselves smile upon this cause. Only when steel has been tested against steel can the accused be declared fully free." The third trial awaited, and with it the very real possibility that both men might die even in the moment of their greatest triumph. The great hall slowly emptied as word spread throughout Frostgard of the stunning revelations that had unfolded during the trial. But for Thoric and Leif, there was no celebration, no moment of relief to savor their vindication. Ancient law demanded completion of all 3 trials, and the trial by combat remained, perhaps the most dangerous test of all, since it could claim their lives even in the hour of their greatest triumph. They were returned to their cells to await the final trial. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The guards who escorted them did so with something approaching reverence, while the jeers and suspicious glances of earlier days had been replaced by expressions of sympathy and respect. Word of Leif's heroism during the Great Raid was spreading like wildfire through the community, carried by those who remembered him as a boy and were now ashamed of their failure to recognize the man he had become. 20 years, Leif said quietly, as they sat in their stone prison. The weight of vindication somehow heavier than the burden of accusation had been. 20 years I carried the shame of being thought dead, while the real thief prospered from his crime. There were nights I wondered if madness might be a blessing, if losing my mind might be easier than carrying the weight of being nobody to everyone who had once mattered to me. Thoric reached through the bars to grasp his friend's shoulder, feeling the solid reality of flesh and bone beneath his palm. "But you endured. You survived when a lesser man would have given up entirely. That speaks to a strength that goes deeper than muscle and sinew. Did I survive?" Leif asked, his winter blue eyes reflecting years of accumulated pain. "Or did I simply continue breathing, while everything that made me who I was slowly died away? I'm not the same person you remember, brother. The fire burned away more than just my face. It consumed parts of my soul that I fear can never be recovered." Before Thoric could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their cells. But these were not the heavy boots of guards or the measured pace of officials. These steps were lighter, more tentative, accompanied by whispered voices that spoke of nervous anticipation. The first to appear was Gunnar the Smith, his massive frame filling the narrow corridor as he approached their cells. Behind him came a delegation that surprised Thoric with its composition, not just the wealthy merchants and established warriors he might have expected, but farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and laborers, people whose lives had been touched by both men in different ways over the years. "We come to speak of the combat trial," Gunnar said without preamble. his voice carrying the directness of a man accustomed to shaping iron with hammer and fire. "There are things you should know before you face whatever champions the jarl has chosen." Thoric felt his stomach clench with apprehension. "What manner of champions?" "That is what troubles us," replied Harold the fisherman, a weathered man whose nets had fed Frostgard through countless harsh winters. "The jarl has sent word to neighboring settlements, calling for warriors to serve as champions in a trial by combat. But the men who have answered that call—" He paused, clearly struggling with what he was about to say. "Mercenaries," Gunnar said bluntly. "Hired swords, who fight for coin rather than honor. Men with no stake in our community or concern for justice. They have come not to serve the cause of truth, but to earn blood money for defeating famous warriors in supposedly fair combat." The implications hit Thoric like a physical blow. A trial by combat was supposed to be a test of divine favor, a way for the gods to reveal their will through the clash of honorable warriors. But if the jarl was importing professional killers to serve as champions, the trial became nothing more than an elaborate execution. "Why would Eric do such a thing?" Thoric asked, though even as he spoke he suspected he knew the answer. The jarl was a practical man who had spent decades building Frostgard into a prosperous and stable community. Having his most trusted enforcer revealed as someone who would abandon duty for the sake of personal loyalty threatened the very foundations of the order he had worked so hard to establish. "He fears you," said Astrid's voice from the shadows of the corridor. Thoric's wife stepped into the torchlight, her face pale but determined. "He fears what your choice represents, what it means for the absolute authority he has wielded for so many years. If his most loyal servant can defy him successfully, what does that say about the power of his position?" She moved closer to the bars, her potter's hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "But there is more to it than that. Word has reached him of how the people are responding to today's revelations. They are not just seeing Leif as an innocent man wrongly accused. They are seeing him as a hero who was abandoned by his own community, allowed to suffer in exile, while those who should have recognized and helped him prospered instead." Thoric began to understand. The story of Leif's 20 years of wandering was more than just a personal tragedy. It was an indictment of Frostgard itself, a community that had failed one of its most loyal sons and allowed injustice to flourish in the name of order and stability. "The people are asking uncomfortable questions," Astrid continued. "If this could happen to Leif, if a hero could be declared dead and forgotten while a thief was allowed to prosper, what other injustices might be hidden beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect society? Eric sees your friendship, your willingness to risk everything for loyalty, as a threat to the pragmatic approach that has kept our community stable for so long. So he imports killers to ensure we die in combat," Leif said quietly. "Even though we have been proven innocent, even though the truth has been revealed, he cannot allow us to survive as living reminders of how justice can be corrupted by expediency." The weight of this realization settled over the group like a funeral shroud. They had fought so hard to prove brotherhood and innocence, only to discover that the final trial was rigged against them from the beginning. But it was Magnus, Thoric's 14-year-old son, who stepped forward with an observation that changed everything. "Father," he said, his young voice carrying a clarity that cut through their despair, "you have spent 20 years teaching me and Bjorn about honor and duty, about the difference between what is legal and what is right. You have always said that a man's worth is not measured by his success, but by his willingness to do what is right, even when it costs him everything." Thoric looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not just the boy he had been trying to protect, but the man he was becoming. "What are you saying, Magnus?" "I'm saying that win or lose, live or die, you have already achieved something more important than victory. You have shown all of us what it means to keep faith, what it costs to honor the promises that matter most. The people of Frostgard will not forget that lesson, regardless of what happens in the combat trial." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled crowd. These were not just visitors come to offer sympathy. They were witnesses to something profound. People whose understanding of honor and loyalty had been fundamentally changed by what they had observed over the past 3 days. "There is something else," Gunnar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something the jarl does not know. Something that might give you an edge in the combat to come." He reached into his leather apron and withdrew 2 objects wrapped in oiled cloth, weapons that gleamed with the distinctive finish of his finest work. "I have been forging these in secret since the night you were arrested. Call it a smith's intuition, or call it hope. But I felt in my bones that you would need them before this was over." The swords he revealed were masterpieces of the metalworker's art, perfectly balanced and honed to edges that could split a hair. More than that, they were clearly made as a matched pair, their hilts wrapped with leather that bore the same knotwork pattern as the silver rings that marked Thoric and Leif's brotherhood. "I made them from steel that came from the same source, forged them in the same fire, cooled them in the same quench," Gunnar explained. "Just as your rings were made to be identical, these blades share the same steel, the same spirit. Whatever happens in the trial, you will face it with weapons worthy of the bond you share." As Thoric took the sword in his hands, feeling its perfect weight and balance, he realized that something had changed in the darkness of their prison. They were no longer just 2 men facing impossible odds. They had become symbols of something larger, representatives of values that their community had almost forgotten in its pursuit of prosperity and stability. The trial by combat would still come. The imported champions would still try to kill them. But they would not face that challenge alone, and they would not face it without honor. Outside their cells, the people of Frostgard were learning what it meant to have heroes among them again, not the distant figures of legend and saga, but real men who were willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of loyalty and truth. Whatever the morning brought, win or lose, live or die, their story had already changed everything. Dawn came grey and cold to Frostgard, shrouded in mist that rolled off the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants. The great hall had been cleared of its usual furnishings, transformed into an arena where ancient law would be satisfied through the clash of steel and the spilling of blood. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls, their flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation of the violence to come. At the center of the cleared space stood a circle marked in white lime, 20 paces across, the traditional boundary within which the trial by combat would be fought. Beyond that sacred ring, benches had been arranged to accommodate the crowd that had gathered despite the early hour, drawn by word of mouth and an almost magnetic need to witness this final test of brotherhood and honor. Jarl Eric sat in his chair of judgment, moved from its usual place to overlook the combat circle. His weathered face showed no emotion, but Thoric could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the carved armrests with white-knuckled intensity. This trial would determine more than just the fate of 2 men. It would test the very foundations of the order he had spent decades building. The champions stood ready on the opposite side of the circle, and Thoric felt his heart sink as he took their measure. These were not honorable warriors fighting for principle or community. These were killers, professional soldiers whose bodies bore the scars of countless battles, fought for nothing more noble than coin. The first was a giant of a man called Ragnar the Red, whose massive frame made even Thoric look small by comparison. His arms were thick as tree trunks, covered in ritual scars that spoke of victories won through brute force and savage endurance. The axe he carried was a fearsome weapon, its double-bladed head gleaming with the kind of care that only a man who lived by violence would lavish on his tools. His companion was Eric the Wolf, lean and quick where Ragnar was massive and brutal. Grey-bearded despite his apparent youth, he moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his twin swords hanging at his sides like fangs waiting to strike. His eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of a man who had killed so often that death had become merely another day's work. Mercenaries, Leif whispered as they were led into the circle, their shackles finally removed so they could fight with unbound hands. Professional killers imported specifically to ensure we die, even in our moment of vindication. Thoric hefted the sword Gunnar had forged for him, feeling its perfect balance and keen edge. The weapon felt alive in his hands, an extension of his will and purpose. Beside him, Leif drew his matching blade, and for a moment they stood back in the ancient formation they had learned as boys, the stance of brothers, who would die before they would allow harm to come to each other. Olaf the law speaker struck his runic staff against the stone floor, the sound echoing through the hall like the crack of breaking bones. "Let all bear witness," he intoned in his ancient voice, "that this trial is conducted according to the oldest laws of our people. Combat will continue until death or surrender claims the defeated. May the gods show their favor to those who fight in service of truth." The crowd had grown silent, hundreds of voices stilled by the weight of what they were about to witness. In the front row, Thoric could see his family, Astrid holding little Sigrid close, while Magnus and Bjorn sat rigid with barely controlled emotion. Their faces showed a mixture of pride and terror, love and desperate hope that somehow their husband and father would find a way to survive this final test. But it was the faces in the rows behind them that truly struck Thoric's heart. These were the people he had served for 20 years. The farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and merchants, whose lives he had protected and whose disputes he had settled. They had come not just to witness a trial by combat, but to see whether the values they claimed to hold dear would prove stronger than the expedients that had governed their community for so long. "You know, this is meant to be our death," Leif said quietly as they waited for the signal to begin. "Even if we fight with all the skill we possess, even if we summon every lesson learned in 20 years of battle, these men were chosen specifically because they are better than us." "Perhaps," Thoric replied, adjusting his grip on the sword's leather-wrapped hilt. "But they fight for coin, while we fight for something that cannot be bought or sold. They fight as individuals seeking personal gain, while we fight as brothers whose bond has been tested by time and proven true. Is that enough?" Thoric looked at his friend, his brother, seeing past the scars and weathering to the boy who had once saved him from drowning, who had shared honey cakes with a lonely child, who had sealed their friendship with blood and pain willingly given. "It has to be, because if it is not, if brotherhood and loyalty cannot triumph over mercenary skill, then what hope does honor have in a world that values only success?" The horn sounded, a long, mournful note that seemed to echo from the mountains themselves. The trial by combat had begun, and with it, the final test of whether two men who had sworn to stand by each other until the end of all things could make good on that impossible promise. The combat erupted with savage intensity as Eric the Wolf launched himself forward, his twin blades weaving patterns of death in the torchlight. Thoric barely parried the first strike, the impact sending vibrations up his arm. The mercenary's second sword came around in a vicious arc that would have opened Thoric's throat, if not for Leif's intervention. His blade deflecting the killing blow, Ragnar the Red advanced like an avalanche, his massive axe cleaving air where Leif had stood moments before. The weapon buried itself in stone with such force that granite chips flew, drawing blood from a spectator's cheek. The giant's recovery was unnaturally quick, the axe reversing to sweep horizontally, forcing both brothers backward. "Stay together!" Thoric shouted over the clash of weapons. "They want to separate us, fight us individually." The mercenaries moved with deadly coordination, Eric driving Thoric back while Ragnar circled left, using his reach to keep Leif at bay with sweeping strokes that whistled through the air. Blood began to flow. Eric's blade found Thoric's ribs, opening a gash that stained his tunic crimson, while Ragnar's axe scraped Leif's arm, parting mail and flesh. The crowd gasped at each near miss. "You fight well for dead men," Eric taunted, pressing his attack. "But skill without ruthlessness is elaborate suicide. You still fight like men who believe in honor." The wolf fainted high, then dropped low, his blade slicing toward Thoric's leg, not to kill, but to cripple. Only desperate reflexes saved Thoric's hamstring, but the price was position. He stumbled backward, separated from Leif. Ragnar seized the opportunity, his axe sweeping horizontally. Leif threw himself flat, the massive blade passing over him, shearing away strands of hair. As the giant committed to the strike, Leif rolled up inside his guard, sword driving toward Ragnar's ribs. The blow should have been mortal, but the mercenary's mail held. Instead of piercing his heart, Leif's blade opened a gash along his side, painful but not fatal. Ragnar's counter-strike came instantly, the axe handle slamming into Leif's chest with battering ram force. Leif flew backward, sword spinning from numbed fingers as he crashed into the circle's boundary. Blood frothed on his lips, ribs clearly broken. The crowd cried out as their hero struggled to breathe, groping for his fallen weapon. "Brother!" Thoric roared, trying to reach Leif, but Eric blocked his path, twin swords keeping the giant at bay. "This is how legends die," Ragnar said, stalking toward wounded Leif, axe rising. "Not in glorious battle, but broken on cold stone, abandoned by the gods." As the axe reached its peak, something extraordinary happened. From the crowd came young Magnus's voice, cutting through combat like a blade. "Remember the salmon." The words struck Leif like lightning, flooding his mind with childhood memories. His friend nearly drowning, how pride could lead to disaster, how survival sometimes required accepting help rather than fighting alone. As Ragnar's axe descended, Leif did something against every warrior instinct. Instead of rolling away, he called out, "Brother, now!" The word conveyed everything, trust absolute, strategy born of perfect understanding. Thoric responded instantly, his sword leaving his hand in a perfect arc, spinning across the circle to slam point first into Ragnar's back, driving between mail rings to find flesh beneath. The giant's axe went wide as he arched in pain, the weapon clattering to stone as he fell forward. Thoric's blade protruding from his chest, the hall erupted in chaos as battle's tide shifted. But the fight was far from over. Eric the Wolf stood alone now, his emotionless eyes surveying the changed battlefield with the cold calculation of a predator assessing new odds. His partner lay dead, felled by a perfect throw that spoke of brotherhood deeper than mere alliance. But the mercenary showed no grief for his fallen companion, only the slight adjustment in stance that marked a professional killer adapting to unexpected circumstances. "Clever," he said, his twin swords weaving lazy patterns as he circled the wounded Leif, who was struggling to retrieve his fallen weapon while favoring his injured ribs. "But throwing away your sword leaves you defenseless, giant. A noble gesture that will cost both your lives." Thoric stood weaponless in the center of the combat circle, his hands empty, but his eyes blazing with the fierce determination that had carried him through 20 years of battle. Around the hall, the crowd had fallen silent, understanding that they were witnessing the climactic moment of a trial that had already transformed their understanding of honor and loyalty. "You think me defenseless?" Thoric asked, moving slowly toward his wounded brother. "You see only the absence of a blade, not the presence of something far more powerful." Eric's response was swift and brutal, a lightning strike aimed at ending the fight before sentiment could interfere with efficiency. Both swords came around in crossing arcs designed to take Thoric's head from his shoulders, but the giant was no longer where the blades expected to find him. Years of fighting beside Leif had taught them to move as one mind in two bodies. As Eric committed to his attack, Thoric dropped low and rolled, coming up beside his friend just as Leif's hand closed around his sword hilt. Without conscious thought or verbal communication, Leif flipped the weapon in his grip and tossed it to his brother. The exchange flowing as smoothly as water finding its course. Thoric caught the blade and spun in the same motion, his counter-strike meeting Eric's recovery with a ring of steel that echoed through the hall like a bell struck by lightning. The mercenary's eyes widened slightly, the first emotion he had shown since the combat began, as he realized he faced Not one wounded opponent, but a partnership that transcended individual skill. The final phase of the battle was swift but decisive. Eric was skilled, perhaps the finest swordsman either brother had ever faced, but he fought as an individual, seeking personal victory. Thoric and Leif fought as two halves of a single warrior, their movements complementing each other with an instinctive harmony that no amount of training could replicate. When Eric pressed his attack against Thoric, Leif was there to guard his blind side. When the wolf tried to exploit Leif's injured ribs, Thoric's blade turned the strike aside. They moved like dancers, performing steps learned in childhood, each anticipating the other's needs before conscious thought could interfere. The end came suddenly. Eric, frustrated by his inability to isolate either opponent, overextended in a desperate attempt to break their formation. Thoric's blade caught his right-hand sword, binding it for just an instant, while Leif's point found the gap beneath his arm, where mail and leather offered insufficient protection. Eric the Wolf died as he had lived, efficiently, without drama or final words. He simply stopped, his weapons falling from nerveless fingers as he collapsed to the stone floor, his flat eyes staring at nothing. The great hall erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of Frostgard. The crowd surged to their feet, shouting acclaim for the brothers who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through the power of loyalty tested by fire and proven true. But even as celebration erupted around them, Thoric and Leif stood quietly in the center of the combat circle, supporting each other as they had always done. Blood from their wounds stained the white lime that marked the boundary of their trial. But they had survived not just the combat, but the deeper test of whether brotherhood could triumph over the calculated cruelty of a world that valued only strength and success. Jarl Eric rose from his chair of judgment, his weathered face showing an expression that none present had ever seen before, something that might have been shame, mixed with grudging respect for what he had witnessed. The practical ruler who had imported killers to ensure a predetermined outcome now found himself face to face with the reality that some things could not be bought, manipulated, or controlled. "The trial is concluded," he announced, his voice carrying clearly over the celebration. "The gods have spoken through trial by combat, declaring their favor for Thoric Eriksson and Leif Grimson. Let all debts be considered paid, all charges dismissed, all accusations proven false." But it was Olaf the law speaker who provided the words that would be remembered long after the wounds had healed and the celebrations had faded. Striking his runic staff against the stone floor, the ancient keeper of their tradition spoke with the voice of generations past and future. Let it be recorded that on this day, brotherhood proved stronger than gold, loyalty more valuable than life, and honor more enduring than the stone beneath our feet. These men have shown us what we had forgotten, that some promises are worth keeping, regardless of cost. Some bonds cannot be broken by time or hardship, and some truths are worth dying for. In the days that followed, Frostgard would undergo changes that went far deeper than any trial or judgment. Sven the merchant faced justice for his 20-year-old theft. But more importantly, the community began to ask themselves what other injustices might be hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect society. Leif was welcomed back not as a returned ghost, but as a hero whose sacrifice had been forgotten and whose loyalty had been repaid with exile. He took his place among the village elders, his wisdom gained through 20 years of hardship, proving invaluable in settling disputes and guiding decisions. Thoric returned to his role as enforcer, but with a deeper understanding of the difference between justice and mere law. His family, shaken by how close they had come to losing him, gained a new appreciation for the values he represented and the courage required to live by them. And at the edge of Frostgard, where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of harsh winds, the blood oath stone stood weathered but unbroken, a testament to promises kept and brotherhood that had survived even death itself. Some bonds, forged in childhood innocence and tempered by adult sacrifice, prove stronger than iron chains or the passage of years. They endure not because they are easy to keep, but because they represent the very best of what it means to be human, loyal, honorable, and willing to stand by those we love, even when the whole world seems arrayed against us. The story of Thoric and Leif became legend, told around winter fires for generations to come, not as a tale of perfect heroes, but as a reminder that ordinary men, faced with impossible choices, can choose to be extraordinary when it matters most.